Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Les damos la bienvenida a la Conferencia de Gloria Gutman. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Les damos la bienvenida a la Conferencia de Gloria Gutman sobre prevención del abuso y negligencia hacia las personas mayores. Gloria Gutman tiene un doctorado en Psicología del Desarrollo y Social, desarrolló el Centro de Investigación en Gerontología y el Departamento de Gerontología en la Universidad Simon Fraser. Actualmente es investigadora asociada y profesora emérita en dicha universidad. Es autora editora de 23 libros. El más reciente se titula Technologies for Active Aging, del año 2013. Actualmente es presidenta de la sección norteamericana de la Sociedad Internacional de Gerontotecnología, vicepresidenta del Centro Internacional de Longevidad de Canadá y miembro del Comité de Gestión de Investigaciones de la Red Canadiense de Fragilidad. Anteriormente formó parte del Consejo sobre el Envejecimiento de la Sociedad del Foro Económico Mundial y del panel asesor de expertos sobre envejecimiento y salud de la Organización Mundial de la Salud. En el 2007 recibió la Orden de la Columbia Británica y en el 2010 un doctorado en Derecho Honoris Causa de la Universidad de Western Ontario por su trabajo como autoridad internacional en el campo de la gerontología. En el 2012, el gobierno de Canadá le otorgó la medalla de jubileo del diamante de la reina Isabel II. Y en el 2016 fue nombrada miembro de la Orden de Canadá, el honor civil más alto del país. Sus investigaciones abarcan temas como vivienda para personas mayores, cuidado a largo plazo, promoción de la salud, maltrato a personas mayores, gerontotecnología, envejecimiento LGBT, hospitales y comunidades amigables con las personas mayores y preparación para emergencias, y cómo incrementar la planificación anticipada de la atención en grupos marginados y minorías étnicas. Al final de la presentación, la doctora Gutman provee sus datos de contacto para quienes tengan preguntas o comentarios. Vamos con la presentación.
Buenos dias. I'm Gloria Gutman, a social and developmental psychologist and gerontologist from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. I'm going to talk to you today about risk and protective factors for elder abuse during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. To set the stage for a discussion of what psychologists can do to help older people now during the pandemic and as we recover from it, I will review some of the evidence of old people indicating that they are high risk in disasters. I want to review some of the statistics on mortality rates for COVID-19 by age. I want to talk and review the types of elder abuse and where it occurs for those of you who are not familiar with it. Then I'm going to turn to a study that we did where we were looking at the reports of older people of discord or family violence, which we used as a measure of elder abuse. And finally, I want to talk about some of the new ways that elder abuse and neglect is being expressed during the pandemic, ways that we really hadn't thought about before. It's important to note that disasters fall into two broad groups: natural and technological. It's the natural ones that we are most familiar with. In some countries, they're seasonal. Every year they have monsoons, they have hurricanes. In my country, Canada, we may have ice storms and floods. And these are becoming more frequent due to global warming and climate change. COVID-19 is in the category of biological epidemic. As this slide notes, depending on the emergency, different groups of people are at increased risks of experiencing social and/or psychological problems. And any subgroup in the population is potentially at risk depending on the nature of the disaster. COVID-19 has been described as the first pandemic of the century, but in fact have been others since the Spanish flu of 1920, including tuberculosis in the late 19th century, polio in the 1950s, and in the case of polio, it was children who were the main victims. We had SARS in 2002. There was the H1N1 and epidemic in 2009 and 2010. And of course, there was the HIV AIDS epidemic, which was first identified in the 1980s, and where gay men were, in particular, were the major victims. But in general, for a variety of disasters, and particularly those that are climate related, age is a clear risk factor for death. And dating back to the tsunami of 2004 in Indonesia, it was very clear that the old people were particularly at risk. And the government of Indonesia estimated that some 130,000 deaths and 40,000 people were missing. 540,000 were displaced. As this slide shows, there were large proportions of older people in those statistics. Turning now to COVID-19, it was very clear early on that the risks were higher, mortality rates were higher in country after country amongst older people. And so amongst the kinds of questions that I began to ask were, is it possible that some of those deaths were due to elder abuse or neglect? For those of us who work in the area of older people and disasters, we know that child abuse and domestic violence rates tend to increase during and after disasters. There's not a lot of hard data available, but if it's affecting, disasters are affecting children and domestic violence rates, there's reason to believe that elder abuse would also increase in situations of disasters. I want to draw your attention to this particular model that is used by people who are in the disaster response business. And the model, called the crunch model, demonstrates the progression of vulnerability from root causes, which include ageism and the devaluation of old people, which in turn affect dynamic pressures, such as urbanization, which in turn result in the creation of unsafe conditions, such as when a hazard, like a heat wave or a flood or an epidemic, occurs. And so if you bring those four conditions together, and what you have is a disaster situation. And being vulnerable is generally understood as being prone or likely to suffer injury, harm, damage, or loss from some event. Or in emergency management, it tends to be defined as the characteristics of a person or group and their situation that influences their capacity to anticipate, to cope with, to resist, and to recover from the impact of a particular hazard. And the disaster response people recognize that some groups are more likely than others to experience loss, harm, injury, and damage, with some of the differentiating factors being a combination of their wealth, their ethnicity, their gender, whether they're disabled, their health, their age, and the social networks that support them under normal conditions. So turning now to elder abuse and where it occurs, there are 5 types that are recognized internationally: physical, psychological, financial, and sexual are known as abuse. And there's also neglect, where a person is not given the necessities of life, where they're not given food, they're not given water, they may not be able to bathe without assistance, and they're not getting that assistance. Many victims, as this slide states, will experience more than one type. For example, if they're living with their adult child, that child might threaten to stop going to the grocery store or cooking meals if his mother doesn't give him her credit card or complete access to her pensions or to her bank account. Or if they don't live together, the daughter might say to her mother, "You'll never see your grandchildren again if you don't give me what I want, which is to move into your house. You can live in the basement." Or in the case of LGBT older adults, the partner may extort money by threatening to out him to his children. So as this slide notes, elder abuse and neglect occur in the community, and people living independently in the community, as well as in a range of shelter and care settings that include assisted living and long-term care. In terms of institutional settings, following Hurricane Katrina and the tsunami in Japan, there were TV and newspaper reports of old people being abandoned by nursing home and hospital staff. There were also rumors following Hurricane Katrina of physical, sexual, and financial abuse of older people who were in shelters and other settings where they were relocated. In Fukushima, Japan, more than 125 elderly Japanese patients, some of them comatose, were said to have been abandoned by the medical staff at a hospital 6 miles from the damaged nuclear plant. In the case of Canada, recently during the COVID-19 disaster, the Army was called in to help with older people in nursing homes in Quebec and Ontario. These homes had been severely understaffed historically, and when the pandemic hit, it became even worse, with staff getting sick and or staying home because they were afraid of getting sick. And as a result, there were not enough staff to look after the residents. So they became neglected. And as I said, it was severe enough that the government called in the army to help out. This slide shows that very early on, and you'll see it's dated May of 2020, it was quite clear that the bulk of deaths in Canada were happening amongst people living in long-term care homes. So at that time, approximately 80% of the deaths were occurring in old age homes. And COVID-19 got portrayed in the media as a disease of old people. And there were even some nasty social media postings where they talked about the disease as being a boomer remover. The idea that the baby boom generation, who some people were concerned were going to be a drain on the economy, well, here they're going to be killed off by this disease. Oh, maybe this is, so there was some nasty remarks about this being something that should be celebrated because it got rid of old people. Well, this slide was from yesterday, and it shows that at this point in time, 54% of deaths in Canada are occurring in nursing home populations. We know now that COVID-19 can affect people of all ages. But still, there is the image in the minds of some people that it is a disease of old people, and that therefore the young ones don't have to be careful. They don't have to abide by the public health directives. In terms of risks for people living in long-term care and assisted living during COVID-19, we do have to remember that many were at risk of loneliness and social isolation before the pandemic. Now, in addition to that, they are coping with the fear of, if they haven't had the virus, of contracting it. At the same time, they don't have the supports that they once had to help them, such as organized activities and visits from family. And so we really, as psychologists, need to recognize the extent of disruption that's been caused by doing what our public health people have told us to do, of social distancing, staying home, or visiting only with people in your personal bubble. So we need to think about disruption of social relationships. We need to think about the disruption that's been caused by people who normally would help us or help old people on a day-to-day basis, no longer being able to do so. We also need to think about the issue of monitoring and surveillance. In regular conditions, much of the care of older people is done informally by family. They visit in the nursing homes, they help to feed people, they help to get them dressed, they help with activities. They also have their eyes and ears open so that if there is a situation that's abusive, they can interfere or serve to monitor and to identify potential problems. Sometimes it's potential problems between residents. So we hear about resident aggression, where one older person may push or shove another one, the person falls down and it does not recover from the injury that occurs. But we need to think of this disruption not only in institutional settings, which is what the media has been talking about a lot, but also to recognize that this applies equally to seniors who are living in the community. In the case of where they're living with somebody else, those other people may have frayed nerves, they may feel stressed because of their job loss. They may say, if you love me, you'll loan me. So that's an example of financial abuse. In the case of family caregivers, they may be feeling stressed. They may be feeling like they're in a state of burnout that is intensified, it's exacerbated by not being able to get any respite because adult daycare centers are closed or home support's been discontinued. And the absence of family visitors to old people who are living in the community, many of them live alone, there's the potential for physical or psychological abuse by people who might be there to supposedly help them. And if you don't have family visitors, who's going to be the watchdog? Who's going to be to provide the surveillance so that the older person doesn't get taken advantage of by people that prey on them and that are really not legitimate in terms of providing the care or help that they say they will. So there's research to date that shows that social isolation, financial instability, underlying chronic conditions can lead to increased depression and anxiety. And these are known to make older adults more susceptible to abuse. There's research of older adults becoming overwhelmed, feeling hopeless, feeling anxious, feeling stressed, angry, withdrawn because they've been forced to be quarantined. There was a Canadian study that was done in 2020, which showed that some 32% of people 15 years of age and older were concerned that when people were socially isolated, when they were staying home, there would, especially if they were living with other people, there was a potential for family stress from that confinement. And another 8% actually talked specifically about violence in the home. So we were interested in how older Canadians perceive the impact of COVID-19 on their physical and mental health and lifestyle. We were interested in its impact on their preparation for future health care. And because one of the areas I work in is elder abuse and neglect, I was very interested to know if family violence and discord were being perceived by older people to be increasing now during COVID-19. So we conducted a survey. It was done online between August and October of 2020. The survey had 61 items, and you can see on this slide, they were in 5 major categories. The respondents, the people who participated in the survey, were aged 55 and over, 55 to 90. And we recruited them using social media, direct email, and we were particularly successful in recruiting through Facebook advertising. As well, we had the help of some 85 local, regional, national organizations that drew older people's attention to our survey. And the research objectives I want to talk about now are those that would help us from this respondent experience and to explore the potential determinants and consequences by comparing the socio-demographic characteristics of those who experience frequent family discord or physical violence with those who didn't, and to determine if these two groups differed in terms of the negative and positive emotions that they felt, or their difficulty in accessing the care, the food, or the support that they needed. In terms of socio-demographic characteristics, as this slide shows, we looked at age, at gender, sexual orientation, race, education, employment status, marital status, and whether they lived alone. And there were 9 questions on emotions in the category of pandemic-related stressors or social impacts. And specifically, we looked at, were they feeling depressed, lonely, isolated, anxious? Did they feel they were being judged or shamed by others? Did they feel sad? And on the positive side, were they feeling relaxed, happy, or accepted in their community? And so we had a number of questions that were phrased, since the outbreak of COVID-19, I feel. And then the person indicated whether they felt that way most of the time, some of the time, or seldom and never. And so the statistics I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides are the proportions who responded most of the time. The key question is shown on the screen. And so we asked people if, in terms of stress and discord in the family, their experience was, no, it wasn't happening, or if family members were sometimes short-tempered with one another, but there was no physical violence, or if they were frequently short-tempered and there was physical fights, if there were children in the house, that they were fighting with each other, or the most severe category, if family members were frequently short-tempered with one another, and that there were adults in the home throwing things at one another, knocking over furniture, or even with physical violence, hitting and harming one another. Well, what we found was, out of the total sample, there were 62 or 1.5% of the respondents who did say that they were experiencing these things on a fairly, third category of frequently short-tempered, and an additional 14 who said that they were frequently short-tempered with one another. Shows the percentages by age, and first on the left by age group, and indicates that the percentages showing family discord and violence, I guess as we should have expected, were highest in the 55 to 64 age group. So some 51% said that fairly frequently they were experiencing, family discord. Those were people in that 55. That was our youngest age group. We see on this slide that the number experiencing family discord and violence was greater amongst women and men. it was also greater amongst heterosexuals and amongst the by race, the white as compared to the non-white people. This slide shows that rates were higher amongst those who were less educated, also amongst those who were retired or not working, as we might expect, with people who were living with other people as opposed to living alone, and that the rates were higher amongst married people. This slide shows that there were more negative emotions, whether we're talking about depression, loneliness, feeling isolated, anxious, sad, or judged, ashamed. There were more negative emotions amongst those people who were experiencing frequent family disorder, or who reported it, or physical violence. And this slide shows that the routine of life, which was exemplified in the questionnaire as having to do with work, with education, with social life, with hobbies, with religious activities, were much more disturbed amongst those people who said that they were experiencing frequent family discord. And similarly, that those, they were unable to access the medical care that they needed, or frequently didn't have enough to eat, which is symptomatic of neglect. So in summary, what we found in our data was that respondents experiencing frequent family discord or physical violence at home were significantly younger. When you look at their mean age, they were less educated, and they were more likely to be not working. And the most commonly experiencing negative emotions were higher amongst those who said that they were experiencing family violence. The results are alarming, as they also reported higher rates of challenges in getting to the basic necessities, food, support, medical care, and they experience more change in life routine. While these are only a small number, given that all forms of abuse tend to be underreported, we think that these probably represent only the tip of the iceberg. I'm just in process now of analyzing data from a much larger survey, and its show that was conducted later on in the pandemic than ours, and it's showing rates of about 5.5% of the respondents saying that they were in situations that sound like abuse or neglect. So in addition to those classic kinds, what we're seeing during COVID-19 are frauds and scams perpetrated by strangers. So, in the elder abuse literature, the defining characteristic is that the problem is being expressed by someone who is in a situation of trust, a position of trust. So in elder abuse, in classic elder abuse, it's usually family or neighbors or friends, people that you know and where you expect that they would be trustworthy, who are the ones that are the perpetrators of the abuse. But there's also frauds and scams, and these are things that tend to be perpetrated by strangers. And so early on in the pandemic, we heard about puppy scams, where older people were being induced or seduced to buy puppies. And then they would send money in, and the puppy never came. So this was, buying puppies online. The Canadian Anti-Fraud Center also was warning older people to beware of fake government healthcare or people asking for research information or making unsolicited calls. And I think all of us have experienced the telephone calls, the emails that look like they're real, but in fact are not. And where it's somebody asking for urgent action or payment, or saying, well, your grandson has been traveling and is out of money, and what they're trying to do is get to your credit card or to your and it's you get identity fraud. And also there's products that are being marketed that supposedly personal protective equipment, masks, and so on, that are not really of very good quality, or that have been expired, or that are dangerous, that are being sold as if they were the real thing. This slide shows a number of others of the fraudsters that are posing as cleaning or heating companies, or various kinds of financial advisors that are pressuring people to invest in various kinds of stock for products that supposedly are going to be bought up in large numbers and will lead to great financial increase. So, the general kinds of advice that we need as psychologists to be saying to people that we work with is, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably isn't true. And be careful. And, this is not just a Canadian problem. Early on, I was hearing about reports from other countries where there were the same kinds of things that we were hearing about, of people charging for coming into their homes with testing kits that don't exist. And of course, you send your money and nobody shows up. Or if they do show up, it's with a testing kit that really doesn't work. So in terms of the way forward, what do we do? How can we be helpful? Well, one of the things that we need to do is to make sure that older people's issues are concerned or are drawn to attention in all phases of disaster. So before the disaster, we need to make sure that there is involvement of women who tend not to be consulted to the same extent as men, and also older people in the training and preparation for the disaster that has not yet occurred. During the disaster, we need to think about issues that that deal with the health needs, the hygiene of both men and women, which may not be the same, or of older people as compared to younger people. And after the disaster, from the things that we know about other kinds of disasters, different groups tend to be disadvantaged. And when it comes to getting some help to rebuild, some financing if it's been the type of disaster where your house is affected, or where your livelihood, where you can't go to work. But the post-disaster relief is more difficult for some people than for others to access. So we need to recognize that there are different types of risk factors, different types of ways of dealing with a disaster that depending on where you're living. So as it says in this slide, safer at home is a slogan that's being used to promote staying at home so as to curb the spread of COVID-19. But the potential for violence spikes when you're living 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the same home as your abuser. And that abuser could be your spouse, it could be your child, it could be another relative, or it could be a paid caregiver. And while living alone may be a protective factor for physical abuse, it's a risk factor for financial abuse or for frauds and scams. And the fact of the matter is that elder abuse, like COVID-19, doesn't have borders or boundaries, and victims include older adults from all socioeconomic classes, cultures, ethnicities. You may recognize in this picture, these were famous movie stars. That's Mickey Rooney, who was a victim of elder abuse by his son, and gave very dramatic testimony to the US government, which finally brought attention to the fact that elder abuse is much more pervasive than people ever recognized. So I would like to show you the names of the research team that I've been working with on this project and on the others that are part of what we call the ICANN ACP project. And our team, we call ourselves the Diversity Access Team because much of the research that we've been doing is focused on trying to make advanced care planning more accessible to people from minority groups, in particular LGBT, and in Canada, the two largest ethnic minority groups, which are Chinese and South Asian. We gratefully acknowledge the funding that we've received from the Canadian Frailty Network. And if you have, please contact me if you have any questions about this presentation. I encourage you to visit our website for a copy of the 60+ page report of the analysis of our survey by age, gender, and sexual orientation. You can download it for free. If you would like more information about our research team, which we call the Diversity Access Team, please visit the website of the larger ICANN project. Thank you for your attention.